Dust drifted like smoke across the main street of Hollow Creek, carried by a restless wind that never seemed to tire of gnawing at the edges of things. It rattled the empty shutters, stung the eyes of anyone who dared linger outside, and painted the wooden boards of the saloon with a thin veil of grit. Life here was harsh, and for those without land, kin, or coin, it was merciless. Sarah Calloway knew this more than most. Barely 22, she had worn the name widow for 3 months now. Her husband, Jesse, had been a good man, steady with his hands, honest with his word, but even the good die quick in cattle country. A broken leg from a bronco ride gone wrong turned feverish, then septic, and within days she had buried him in the hard ground behind the churchyard. His death left her alone with a newborn son and debts she never even knew existed until the banker came knocking. She tried to manage, tried to sew, to scrub floors, to barter milk for cornmeal, but there was never enough. She had no family nearby, no neighbors willing to shoulder a burden that wasn't theirs, and no laws that protected a woman without means. She'd knock on doors, baby in her arms, and see shutters close as if her grief might infect them. By the time the last of her bread was gone and the baby's cries grew thin with hunger, she was desperate. She didn't even understand how it began, not fully. One of the saloon men, Tom Dyer, a brute with a mouth full of gold teeth, had seen her faltering. Charity, he'd called it, slapping the counter with a grin. Town's full of strong men. Why don't we auction her off proper? Widow gets herself a protector, child gets a father, and the rest of us get a laugh. It was a cruel jest, but in Hollow Creek, cruelty was entertainment. The townsfolk agreed too quickly, hungry for a spectacle. And so, on a Saturday afternoon, when farmers and drifters came to town for whiskey and trading, Sarah was summoned, dragged more than invited, to stand in the corral by the saloon. She clutched her baby, her arms aching from holding him so tight. His tiny breaths warmed the thin cotton shawl she wrapped around him, and the only thing that kept her rooted to the dirt was the knowledge that if she ran, he would starve. The crowd gathered, half drunk already, their faces glistening in the sun. Some laughed, some spat in the dust, some shook their heads as if what was about to happen were only natural. Sarah could hear the words passing among them, each one a knife. Fine hips on that one. Too skinny for hard work, but she do. Might fetch $1, maybe $2. Her cheeks burned with shame, but she stood silent. If she cried, they'd mock her more. If she fought, they'd call her ungrateful. And deep inside, a part of her whispered that maybe, just maybe, this was her last chance to survive. A man might claim her. A man might feed her son. Yet another voice, stronger, screamed that this was wrong. She was not a mule to be sold, nor a sack of grain to be bartered. She was a wife still in mourning, a mother clutching the only piece of Jesse she had left. The baby stirred against her, his soft whimper muffled by the cloth. Sarah pressed her lips to his crown. "Hush now," she whispered so faintly the words barely left her throat. "Mama's here. Mama won't leave you." But her resolve cracked when one of the men, a wiry fellow with sunburnt skin, laughed and pointed. "Ain't no one wantin' a wailing brat along with her. Dead weight, that's what he is. Should have left him with the coyotes." The words struck her like a whip. She turned her body sideways, trying to shield the infant, but it only made them laugh harder. Another man, emboldened, jeered. Auctions for the woman, not the bundle. Toss the babe aside and she fetch higher. Sarah's mouth went dry. She wanted to scream, to fight, to claw at their faces with her nails, but she was outnumbered. They circled her like vultures, eager for cruelty. She prayed silently, words tumbling in her head, begging Jesse to forgive her for being too weak to protect their son. That was when the sack appeared. Someone a ranch hand she didn't recognize picked up a coarse burlap grain sack, shook it out, and smirked. "Here," he drawled, Problem solved. Sarah's heart seized as rough hands pried the child from her arms. She struggled, but another man held her fast, laughter ringing in her ears. The baby's cries split the air, sharp and desperate, before being muffled as he was shoved inside the bag. She screamed then, hoarse and raw, but her voice was swallowed by the noise of the crowd. The sack squirmed on the ground a few feet away, a pitiful, wriggling shape in the dust. Sarah collapsed to her knees, shaking, reaching out only to be yanked upright again and dragged toward the corral center. And so the auction began. Sarah stood trembling, empty-armed, her vision blurred with tears she dared not shed openly. The sun burned mercilessly overhead, and in her chest her heart pounded like a drum of war. Somewhere behind her, her son whimpered faintly. She prayed, oh God, how she prayed that someone, anyone, would hear. The baby's muffled cries wove through the dust and noise, faint as a bird's call in a storm. Each sound drove needles into Sarah's heart. She twisted against the grip of the man who held her, but his fingers dug into her arm like iron. The crowd didn't soften at the sound of the child. If anything, their faces hardened, their laughter sharpened. No one wanted him. That was the truth Sarah heard in every jeer. Her son wasn't a blessing in their eyes. He was baggage, a mouth that needed feeding, a burden that lessened her worth. Leave him be, she pleaded, voice shaking. He's just a babe. He's done no harm. Her words were drowned in the roar of mockery. A tall man with a drooping mustache spat into the dirt and said, "Ain't nobody looking to buy 2 for 1. Best rid the brat. Widows plenty. Trouble as it is." The phrase 2 for 1 stung worse than the grip on her arm. They didn't even see her child as a life, just an added cost. Something disposable. Something to be set aside like a torn saddle or spoiled grain. The sack rustled again, and a pitiful cry escaped it. The sound silenced Sarah's breath. She could picture him inside her boy, Jesse's son, flailing in the darkness, searching for her warmth. Panic seized her. She struggled harder, but the more she fought, the more the crowd laughed. See how she claws? One man shouted, like a cat over a runt kitten. Ain't worth nothin', but you scratch you bloody to keep it. Laughter rippled again. Someone gave the sack a shove with his boot, sending it rolling a few inches in the dust. Sarah screamed. A woman's voice, sharp and shrill, cut through the men's noise. Old Mrs. Crenshaw, the boarding-house keeper, leaned against the fence rail, arms folded. You're wasting your time. That child's a curse. Bad luck to taking a woman with a squalling babe. Mark me, he'll never live to see a year. Best set her free of him. The words carried weight. Folks in Hollow Creek loved their superstitions, and Mrs. Crenshaw's tongue was as trusted as a preacher's sermon. Several men nodded. Sarah felt her stomach twist, but she forced her chin. Hi. He is no curse, she said, voice quivering but fierce. He is my son. He is all I have left. Her defiance was met with cold indifference. Tom Dyer, the gold-toothed brute who had suggested the auction in the first place, chuckled and raised his arms for silence. All right, boys, he drawled. Here's how it goes. Widow comes separate. Any man fool enough to want her, bid what you like. But the babe? He stays in the sack until someone claims him. If no one does. He let the words trail off with a shrug, grinning at the laughter that followed. Sarah's knees nearly buckled. Her throat closed around a cry, but she bit it back. They were bargaining with her son's life as if he were no more than a side of beef. She looked to the crowd desperately, scanning faces for pity. But she found none. Men smirked, elbowed each other, and weighed her with their eyes. They didn't see her son's small fists, his fragile ribs rising with every gasping breath. They saw only inconvenience. The baby whimpered again. To Sarah, it was the most precious sound in the world. To them, it was nails on a board. Shut him up, someone barked. Another laugh. Another boot nudged the sack. Sarah's soul cracked then. A storm of rage and helplessness boiled inside her, and she screamed so loudly that even the drunken men paused. "He is not for sale." Her voice rang with a strength she didn't know she possessed. "He is mine, and no man here will lay claim to him." But silence gave way to ridicule again. Tom Dyer sneered. "Then you'll both starve, widow. Ain't a man in this town fool enough to feed two mouths when one'll do." The words struck her like stones. The truth of them echoed in the faces around her. Even those who might have considered taking her in shook their heads. A woman could be useful, a cook, a bed warmer, a pair of hands. A baby? Just another mouth. Nobody wanted him. And in that moment, Sarah understood the cruelty of Hollow Creek in its clearest form. Mercy was for men with power. Compassion was for the strong. For the weak, for her child, there was only dust, mockery, and the waiting. "Sack?" She sagged against her captor, heart pounding with terror. Her baby rustled faintly within the burlap. And though her spirit cried out to shield him, her body trembled with the knowledge that she was powerless. The auctioneer's voice rang out then, sharp and cruel. "All right, gents, let's start the bidding. Who'll take the widow, Calloway?" "Off our hands?" the crowd roared. The sack lay forgotten by most, but not by Sarah. To her, it screamed louder than any voice in that corral. The burlap sack lay at the edge of the corral like a discarded feed bag, its corners twitching with the faint movements of the baby within. To Sarah, it was no inanimate thing. It was a coffin waiting to close, a cruel prison that muffled her. Sons' cries until they came out broken, strangled, and pitiful. Every instinct in her body screamed to tear free, to rush to the sack, to scoop her boy into her arms. But the men kept her penned, laughter and jeers hemming her in as tightly as the wooden rails. "Widow's fightin' already," one man snorted. "Best let her wear herself out, for she's taken home." The crowd chuckled, but the sack stirred again, this time with a thin wail that silenced Sarah's own breath. She flinched as though the sound were a lash across her back. It was his call, her baby calling for her, for warmth, for milk, for safety. And she could not go to him. Someone gave the sack another nudge with his boot. The baby inside rolled, and a chorus of chuckles rippled through the men. "Listen to him," the boot's owner drawled. "Squalling like a piglet in a poke. Ain't worth the trouble." Sarah's chest burned. Her eyes stung. "Stop it," she cried, the words torn from her throat. "He's a child, my child." Her cry was met with more derision. Tom Dyer, the ringleader, grinned his gold-toothed grin. "That's the point, widow. You want someone to bid on you. Best let go of that bundle. No man wants to feed another man's brat." The men nodded, muttering in agreement. The logic was simple, brutal, and unyielding. A woman might have value. A baby did not. Sarah shook her head furiously, strands of hair sticking to the sweat on her cheeks. "I will not leave him," she whispered, though the words shook. "I will not." The sack twitched again. This time the baby gave a muffled cry that rose above the noise, a cry that was unmistakably a plea. Sarah nearly buckled. It was the sound of need, the sound that had woken her in the night for weeks now, the sound that bound her to him with a tether stronger than rope, but the men around her remained unmoved. "Bag the brat tighter," someone jeered. "He'll quiet down soon enough." The suggestion turned Sarah's stomach to ice. She lunged toward the sack, wild with desperation. For a moment she thought she might break free, but rough hands shoved her back. The world tilted, and she stumbled into the dust, choking on grit. From her knees, she saw the sack lying still, the small movements inside slowing. A whimper escaped, softer this time, as though the babe's strength was failing. Panic seized her like claws at her throat. Please, she sobbed, voice raw. Please don't let him die in there. He's just a babe, please. The crowd's response was silence, followed by one bitter laugh. Ain't nobody killing him, widow, just letting nature decide. Nature. That word was their shield, their excuse. Nature was hard, unforgiving, merciless. But Sarah knew this wasn't nature, it was cruelty. Men choosing to let an innocent child suffer. Her hands clawed at the dirt. She thought of Jesse, buried in the churchyard. She thought of how he'd pressed a weak hand to her cheek before death took him, whispering, "Take care of him, Sarah. Promise me." She had promised. And now here she was, forced to watch as that promise unraveled at the whim of drunken men. Her heart pounded with a wild, helpless rage. She screamed again, the sound ragged, feral. "Cowards! Every one of you! Not a man among you if you'd stand by and watch a babe smother." The insult drew growls and threats. A few men spat in her direction. Tom Dyer raised a hand to silence them, still grinning. "Easy now, boys. Don't let her claws fool you. She'll settle down soon enough. Let's get this auction started proper." But Sarah's eyes never left the sack. Every breath she took was shallow, broken, waiting for the next twitch, the next muffled whimper. Each second stretched into eternity. She had nothing left but her son. If the sack went still, so did she. The auctioneer's voice began its sing-song call, rattling off bids that were half serious, half mocking. The men roared with laughter, treating her fate as a game. But through it all, Sarah barely heard. Her world had narrowed to the burlap sack, the fragile life inside, and the pounding of her own blood in her ears. And then so faint she almost thought she imagined it came the smallest word. A sound shaped not by knowledge but by need, not by language but by love. Mama. Sarah froze. Her breath stopped. The crowd erupted in laughter again, but she did not hear them. All she heard was her son's voice, broken but unmistakable, reaching for her through the dark. Her knees buckled, and she collapsed into the dirt, hands outstretched toward the sack. "I'm here, my love," she whispered, her voice trembling. With both agony and hope, Mama's here. The laughter swelled around her, cruel and deafening. But above it, that single, fragile word still echoed in her soul. The sound of that faint, trembling "Mama" lingered in Sarah's heart even as the crowd roared with laughter, mocking the baby's accidental cry as though it were a trick. To them, it was a joke, a freakish mimicry of speech, something to laugh about over whiskey later. But to Sarah, it was a plea, a fragile miracle. Proof that her child, though small and weak, knew her voice, her scent, her arms. Proof that he wanted her. Her body ached to scoop him into her embrace, but she couldn't move. They wouldn't let her. A heavy hand pressed down on her shoulder, keeping her crouched in the dirt like an animal on display. The laughter around her blurred. Her ears rang with the sound of her son's cry, muffled by burlap. She bit her lip until the metallic taste of blood filled her mouth, trying to choke back the sobs rising in her chest. She could not show them weakness. She had learned that already. Tears, when witnessed by cruel men, were not answered with kindness. They were fuel for more cruelty. So she wept silently. Her face turned slightly away, her lashes trembling but her mouth closed tight. The tears slid down her dirt-streaked cheeks, hot trails that burned against her cold skin. Somewhere in the crowd, a man barked a laugh. "Did you hear that? The brat's talking already. Must be one o' them cursed children after all. Tongue. Like a demon, that one." Mrs. Crenshaw clucked her tongue, her sharp voice slicing the air. "I warned you. Mark my words, no good'll come of him. Child ain't natural. Sayin' mama like that? Omen if I ever heard one." Sarah lifted her head at that, her tear-streaked face pale but burning with fury. "He is not cursed." She spat, her voice hoarse. "He is a child, my child, and the Lord himself gave him breath." "You speak of curses? Then curse your own hearts for turning cruel against the innocent." The boldness of her words hushed the crowd for a moment. Even Tom Dyer's grin faltered. But then, as always, the silence gave way to derision. "Hear that?" he called. Widows found her tongue. Best she learned that mouths don't fill bellies. The men chuckled, their attention already shifting back to the auction. Sarah's words had shaken nothing. Her tears silent, hidden though they were, had bought no sympathy. Her baby rustled again in the sack, and another muffled whimper reached her ears. She bowed her head, her body trembling with grief. Inside her, two forces battled, despair and defiance. One told her to give up, to close her heart and let the cruelty of Hollow Creek swallow her whole. The other, fiercer still, screamed that she could never surrender, not while her son drew breath. Her silent tears fell onto the dirt, darkening it in tiny blotches. She prayed without words, only a desperate litany echoing in her mind. "Please, Lord, send someone. Send anyone who has a shred of mercy left. Don't let him die in that sack." The auctioneer's chant began again, this time with louder calls, and the men shouted bids that weren't even coin but jokes. "I'll give you a jug o' whiskey for her," one hollered. "2 jugs if you throw in the brat," another added, followed by cruel laughter. Sarah shut her eyes tight. Her lips quivered, but she held her tongue. She could not plead any more not. To them, they would only mock her further. Her silence was all she had left. So she prayed through her tears. Her body remained still, trembling but unbroken, while inside her soul raged and sobbed. Then came another kick at the sack. The baby let out a weak, startled cry, too weak, too tired. Sarah's eyes snapped open, her whole body lurching forward. She strained against the grip on her arm until her muscles screamed, "Stop, stop it, for God's sake." The man holding her only tightened his grasp. "Quiet now," he growled in her ear. "You'll fetch better if you don't come across half wild." Better. As though she were a Mari in a horse sale, Sarah let out a hollow laugh through her tears. They didn't see her grief, didn't hear her prayers. All they saw was something to bid on, but her baby saw her. He had cried for her. He had spoken that one broken word, Mama. That thought gave her the strength to endure the humiliation, to let her tears fall silently while her heart waited. Somewhere, somehow, she told herself, help must come. The Lord would not forsake a child's cry, and so she stood trembling in the dust, her cheeks wet, her body aching, while the crowd howled their laughter and bids. Silent tears streamed down her face, unseen by those who mocked her, but witnessed, she believed, by heaven itself. The sun was leaning westward, bleeding gold across the dusty sky when a lone rider appeared on the far edge of Hollow Creek. His horse, a sturdy bay with a white blaze on its nose, carried him with the easy gait of an animal long used to miles of open range. The rider sat tall in the saddle, broad-shouldered beneath a weathered coat, his hat pulled low to shade his eyes. Ethan McAllister had not come looking for trouble. He had come for salt blocks, nails, and a new coil of rope simple supplies. For the ranch he kept 2 valleys over. His days were filled with long rides, fence repairs, branding calves, and the quiet company of cattle. He preferred it that way. Towns, with their noise and greed, were places he endured only when necessity forced him. But as he drew closer, he noticed something unusual. A crowd had gathered in the corral beside the saloon, voices rising in laughter, shouting, and mockery. It wasn't the sound of men bartering cattle or horses. This was uglier, rawer, tinged with cruelty. Ethan slowed his horse, narrowing his eyes. He knew the shape of a livestock auction well enough, but this wasn't it. The figure standing at the center wasn't a beast for trade, it was a woman. A young woman, clutching her shawl tightly around herself, hair tangled, face pale with shame and fury. He pulled his horse to a stop, studying the scene. The men were bidding with jugs of whiskey, sacks of flour, scraps of coin. Their laughter rang cruel and hollow. Ethan's jaw tightened. Then his gaze shifted, and he saw the sack dot. It lay half in the dirt, half propped against a fence post, twitching faintly. A muffled whimper floated from it, thin and desperate. Ethan's stomach lurched. He knew that sound. It was no animal. It was a child. For a moment, disbelief rooted him to the saddle. Men could be cruel, yes. He'd seen shootings over card games, beatings behind barns, hunger driving folks to steal. But this was a cruelty he hadn't thought even Hollow Creek capable of. The auctioneer's voice carried on, sing-song and mocking. Do I hear $3? 3 to the man with a flour sack? 4? Who's got 4? Laughter. Jeers. Ethan swung down from his saddle, his boots striking the dirt with a thud. He looped his reins over the hitching post, but kept his hand near the butt of his revolver as he strode toward the corral. The crowd parted slightly, curious at the stranger's approach. What's this? Ethan called, his voice steady but sharp enough to cut through the noise. Tom Deere turned, his gold teeth flashing in a grin. Auction, he said cheerfully. Widow here needs herself a husband. We're just helping her find one. Ethan's eyes flicked to the woman. Her tear-streaked face lifted toward him for a breathless instant, eyes wide with desperation, then dropped again as though she dared not hope. And the sack? Ethan asked, his voice lower now, colder. A ripple of uneasy laughter moved through. The men, dead weight, someone muttered. Piglet and a poke, another added. Ethan's gaze hardened. That's no piglet, he said flatly. That's a child. Tom Dyer chuckled, but his smile faltered when Ethan took another step forward. Ain't your concern, stranger. We're just having a bit o' fun. Ethan's boots crunched in the dust as he walked toward the sack. He didn't raise his voice, but there was iron in it when he spoke. Fun? You call it? Stuffing a babe in a feed bag? The crowd shifted uneasily. A few men avoided his gaze. Others muttered excuses. But no one moved to stop him as he crouched. Beside the sack, the burlap twitched again. Ethan's calloused hands, steady from years of ranch work, untied the rough knot and pulled the opening wide. Inside, a tiny face turned upward, flushed and damp with sweat, eyes scrunched tight from crying. The baby's small fists flailed weakly. And then one clutched at Ethan's coat as though begging for rescue. Ethan lifted the child gently into his arms. The weight was feather-light, yet it pressed heavy on his chest. He looked back at the men, his gaze cold as steel. This ain't no game, he said, his voice carrying across the corral. You ought to be ashamed. Silence hung for a beat, broken only by the baby's thin cry. Sarah gasped softly, her hands trembling at her sides. For the first time since the nightmare began, her eyes lit with the faintest spark of hope. Rancher had entered the circle, and nothing, not even the cruelty of Hollow Creek, would remain the same. The baby stirred in Ethan's arms, squirming against his rough coat. His little fists opened and closed as if searching for something he had been denied too long. Then came a sound fragile, plaintive, but clear enough to pierce the very marrow of the men who heard it. Mama. It was no trick of imagination this time, no muttering muffled by burlap. It was a soft cry, shaped by desperation, that reached out and latched onto every soul within earshot. Sarah gasped as though struck. Her knees buckled, and she caught herself on the fence rail, her breath coming in sobs she could no longer hold back. Her son, her boy, was calling for her again, this time from the safety of another's arms. The sound tore through the last of her restraint, and tears streamed openly down her cheeks. The crowd, so full of jeers moments ago, fell strangely quiet. A few men shifted their boots, suddenly uncomfortable. Laughter sat sour in their throats. They could shrug off a mother's sobs, mock a widow's pleas, even kick at a burlap sack. But the cry of a baby, calling for his mother, held a power. Deeper than whiskey or mockery. Ethan stood straight, the infant nestled against his chest. His broad hand cradled the tiny head with surprising gentleness for a man accustomed to reins and branding irons. He looked out over the crowd, and his voice carried with the weight of iron. "You hear that?" he said. "That ain't dead weight. That's a child crying for his mother." The silence deepened. The saloon's piano, faint in the background, faltered and stopped. A tumbleweed scratched along the street as if even the wind had stilled to listen. Tom Dyer's grin wavered. "You're macking more of this than it is, stranger." "Just a squalling babe. Women get too attached to the noise they make." Ethan's gaze sharpened, pinning him like a nail. "Noise?" His voice was low, dangerous. "That noise is life. And you stuffed it in a sack." The baby whimpered again, his tiny fingers clutching the fabric of Ethan's coat. The sound was softer this time, weary, but still full of trust. It pierced Ethan deeper than he expected. He had no wife, no children of his own. His ranch was wide and empty, his nights long and quiet. Yet holding that fragile life against his chest stirred something he hadn't felt in years. Something fierce, protective, immovable. Sarah pressed a trembling hand to her lips. Every muscle in her body screamed to rush forward, to take her son back into her arms. But she dared not move, dared not break the fragile shift in the air. She could only whisper through her sobs, "Please, give him to me." Ethan glanced at her then, and their eyes met for the first time. Hers were wide, wet with grief, but burning with a mother's fire. His were steady, flint gray, holding hers with a silent promise. He saw her desperation, her strength hidden beneath the dust and tears, and in that moment he understood. She had fought alone and nearly lost, but she had not surrendered. He took a step toward her. The crowd murmured uneasily. "Now hold on." Tom Dyer barked, trying to wrest back control. "Auction ain't done. Widow's still up for bid. You can't just walk in and—" The baby let out another cry. This one stronger, and buried his face against Ethan's chest. The tiny voice muffled, but one word carried clear as a church bell. "Mama." The crowd shifted again, uneasy, ashamed, some scowling at Deer as if his game had suddenly soured in their mouths. Even the drunkest among them seemed to shrink beneath the weight of that soft cry. Ethan raised his voice, firm and final. "This auction is done." He adjusted the child in his arms, the motion as natural as if he had carried him all his life. "You boys wanted entertainment. What you gave was shame. A mother and child ain't yours to sell." No one moved. The rancher's presence, his steady stance, his voice laced with iron, the revolver at his side held the crowd frozen. Sarah's hand reached forward, trembling. Ethan stepped closer and lowered the baby into her arms. The child latched onto her shawl, burying his face against her chest with a faint sigh of relief. Sarah bent over him, kissing his damp forehead, her tears falling like rain on his soft skin. The men looked away, some red-faced, some muttering excuses as they drifted back toward the saloon. Only Tom Dyer lingered, scowling, his pride smarting under the stranger's judgment. But even he said nothing. Not when Ethan's gaze locked on him, steady as a gun barrel. The rancher stood tall again, his voice steady as he addressed them all. "Shame on every man here. You call yourselves human, but it took a child's cry to remind you what that means." The silence was heavy, but unbroken. And in the middle of it all, Sarah rocked her baby, whispering through her tears, "Mama's here. Mama's here." The corral smelled of sweat, dust, and spilled whiskey. But to Ethan McAllister it suddenly felt like a battlefield after the gun smoke cleared. Men shuffled, ashamed, unable to meet his gaze. Sarah clutched her baby to her chest, rocking gently, whispering her reassurances. The child's whimpers softened, soothed by her heartbeat, but the word he had spoken still echoed in Ethan's mind. Mama. It struck him like a hammer blow. A word not meant for him, yet it had lit a fire deep in his chest. The boy's cry had not only reached his mother's ears, it had reached his own. And in that moment, something shifted inside him. Something he had not felt in years. Ethan had lived alone on the McAllister spread since he was 21, after his parents passed. The ranch was wide and rich with grass, the cattle hardy, the barn solid. By most measures he was a prosperous man. But his nights were silent, save for the lowing of cows and the wind across the plains. His days were filled with work, but not companionship. He had long since stopped thinking of family as something that could be his until now. As he watched Sarah cradle her baby, dust streaked across her tear-wet cheeks. He felt it with startling clarity. He could not walk away, not from her, not from the boy. The thought rooted itself in him as firmly as fence posts driven into hard ground. It wasn't pity. He had seen pity before, and it was weak. No, this was conviction, steady and immovable. Ethan turned back to the crowd. "This ends here," he said, his voice calm but edged with steel. "No more auctions, no more sacks. You men had your sport, and it's done. You'll not lay hand nor word on this woman or her child again." A murmur rippled. Tom Dyer, ever unwilling to be cowed, spat in the dirt. "And what gives you the right to say so?" His grin flashed again, though weaker now. "One man against all Hollow Creek? You think you can stroll in, wag your finger, and tell us how to live?" Ethan's eyes didn't waver. "Right?" he repeated. "That babe gave me all the right. I heard him cry for his mama. That's more sacred than any fool's bidding game you cooked up." A few men nodded faintly, shame tugging at them. The laughter of earlier now seemed like a sin none wished to admit. Sarah, her arms locked around her child, looked up at Ethan through wet lashes. She couldn't speak, not yet. Her throat was too tight, her voice too broken. But in her eyes was a desperate question, almost a plea. "Will you leave us?" Ethan met her gaze, steady as the earth beneath them, and in that look alone gave his answer. "No one's leaving you here," he said, his words directed at her though spoken loud enough for the crowd to hear. "Not while I'm breathing." Her lips parted, and a soft sob escaped, but this time it wasn't only grief. It was relief. Tom Dyer bristled, fists clenching. But even he sensed the shift in the crowd. The rancher's words had struck a chord. Men who had laughed before now looked at the dirt, unwilling to be counted among Dyer's cruelty. Whatever fight Dyer thought to stir, he would stir it alone. Ethan let the silence hold. Then he stepped forward, offering his hand to Sarah. His palm was broad, scarred, the hand of a man who had built and mended, who had known work and solitude. Slowly trembling, Sarah placed her free hand into his. Her baby stirred again, letting out a softer cry, and pressed his face against her shoulder. The rancher's realization settled like a weight in his chest. This wasn't chance nor just. A moment of passing decency. He had come to town for rope and nails, but Providence had set something else before him. A mother, a child, and a choice. And Ethan McAllister was not a man who turned from responsibility. He squeezed her hand lightly, then looked back at the crowd one final time. "You all saw what happened here. You'll remember it. If any man here so much as troubles this woman again, he'll answer to me." His tone left no room for jest. Sarah's silent tears flowed anew, but they were different now. Not only of sorrow, but of a fragile hope. She bent her head and kissed her baby's crown, whispering, "Did you hear, my love? We are not alone anymore." The crowd, chastened, began to disperse. Some slunk away toward the saloon, others toward their wagons. Only Tom Dyer lingered, but he too turned at last, muttering curses under his breath. And there, in the fading sunlight of Hollow Creek, the widow, her child, and the rancher stood together, an unlikely trinity bound not by blood, but by something stronger, a cry, a vow, and a realization. The air in the corral had changed. Only minutes before, it had been thick with jeers and ugly laughter. Now, silence stretched across the circle of men, broken only by the restless shuffling of boots and the distant creak of the saloon's swinging doors. The bravado had drained from the faces around Sarah, leaving only unease. But unease was not enough. Sarah knew too well how quickly shame could sour into anger. Men who felt their pride stung could turn meaner than before. She clutched her baby tighter, her shoulders curling protectively as if to shield him from the weight of 100 eyes. Ethan sensed it too. He had seen men at poker tables, caught cheating, who reached for their guns not out of courage but because shame demanded it. Hollow Creek was that kind of place, a town that thrived on cruelty and bravado. If he left Sarah standing there alone, the crowd would circle her again the moment his back turned dot, so he didn't leave her alone. Ethan stepped forward and planted himself between Sarah and the crowd, boots solid in the dust. He squared his shoulders, his hand resting easy but deliberate on the butt of his revolver. His voice carried, steady and sharp. "This woman and her child are not yours to sell. Not now, not ever." The words cracked through the tension like a whipped-out Tom Dyer barked a laugh, though it rang hollow. "You can't just claim what ain't yours, stranger. That widow's on the block. You want her, you gotta bid like the rest." Ethan turned his head slowly, pinning Dyer with a stare that made the man shift his weight. "Bid?" Ethan's tone was cold. "I don't bid for people. A man's worth is in cattle or horses, but a woman and her child?" He shook his head, the words steady as iron. "They're worth protecting, not pricing." The crowd murmured. Some looked down, ashamed. Others crossed their arms, defensive, unwilling to be moved. Sarah's breath caught. She had never heard words like that spoken in her defense. Her heart trembled between disbelief and hope. Could this man truly mean what he said? Tom Dyer stepped forward, fists clenched, trying to salvage his pride. "You think you can just take her? Walk into Hollow Creek and tell us how to live? That ain't how it works here." Ethan shifted his stance, widening it in the dust, his tall frame casting a shadow across Sarah where she knelt clutching her baby. His hand rested still on the revolver, but his voice never rose. "Then maybe it's time Hollow Creek learned a new way," he said. The words struck like a stone in still water, rippling outward. Men who had laughed minutes before now felt their throats dry. Ethan wasn't just a passerby with quick words. He was a man who meant every one of them, a man willing to stand his ground. Dyer's jaw worked as though he wanted to spit, but he faltered under the weight of the rancher's gaze. He muttered something low and stepped back, unwilling to be the one to test the stranger's resolve. Ethan glanced over his shoulder, just enough to meet Sarah's eyes. "Stand up," he said gently, though his voice carried enough for the others to hear. Her legs trembled, but she rose, clutching her baby close. For the first time that day, she didn't feel small. The rancher's broad frame shielded her from the circle of men, and for the first time, she believed she might not have to face them alone. Ethan turned back to the crowd, his voice ringing like a bell. "I'll say it plain. This woman and her child come with me. They'll have food, shelter, and protection at my ranch. And if any man here thinks to trouble them again, he'll answer to me." Silence. Then, slowly, men began to drift back. A few muttered about the rancher's nerve, but none dared challenge him outright. The spectacle had soured. The entertainment was gone. Sarah pressed her face against her baby's hair, breathing him in as though reclaiming him from the jaws of death itself. Tears still slid down her cheeks, but now they mingled with something new: gratitude, fierce and overwhelming. Ethan stood firm until the last of the crowd dispersed. Then, and only then, did he let his hand fall from the revolver. He turned slightly, his voice softer now. "You're safe," he said, steady as the earth. Sarah's lips parted, trembling around words she had longed to speak but never thought she would again. "Thank you," she whispered, voice breaking. Ethan gave a short nod, his gaze steady on hers. "No thanks needed, ma'am. You and your boy deserved better than what they gave you. Now you'll have it." And there, in the dust of Hollow Creek, he had done more than end an auction. He had staked a claim, not of ownership, but of protection. Defiance against cruelty, written not in ink or coin, but in the unshakable stand of a single man who refused to let a mother and her child be broken. By the time the last man slunk off toward the saloon, the sun was sliding low across the horizon. Hollow Creek, usually so loud at dusk, was subdued, its men chastened, its pride wounded by the sight of one stranger standing against many. The dust of the corral hung still in the air, catching the last of the light, and in that hush stood Sarah, her baby, and the rancher who had just altered the course of their lives. Sarah pressed her cheek to her son's hair, whispering lullabies through trembling lips. The boy had fallen quiet, comforted by her arms, though now and again he stirred and muttered a soft, half-formed word. "Mama." The sound made her throat ache. For days she had feared he would never speak again, that hunger, fear, and neglect would steal his voice before it had even found its strength. Now, in the safety of her embrace, he seemed to remember how to call for her. Ethan stood a step away, broad shoulders casting a long shadow across the corral. He hadn't spoken since the crowd scattered, but his presence was steady as an oak tree, silent, unmoving, impossible to ignore. Sarah's heart tugged between gratitude and fear. Gratitude for the man who had saved her boy. Fear of what came. Next, at last, she found the courage to speak. "Why did you do it?" she asked, her voice low and raw. "Why risk yourself for strangers? For me?" Ethan turned his gaze from the horizon to her. His eyes were gray, steady, unreadable, yet softened by something she had not expected. "Because what they did was wrong," he said simply, "and I couldn't stand by. A mother and child should never be put through that." Sarah's lips parted, but no words came. Simple as his explanation was, she could see it wasn't all. There was more behind his voice, a depth of conviction that went beyond decency. Ethan shifted his weight, rubbing the back of his neck as though uncomfortable under her searching eyes. "Truth is," he admitted, "I've spent a long time with nothing but cattle for company. Wide land, plenty of sky, but no laughter, no voices. That boy." His voice caught for a moment, surprising even him. He cleared his throat. "That boy called out for his mama, and I reckon I heard more than just a cry. I heard a chance to do right." Sarah's breath hitched. She studied him, the rancher who had stepped into her nightmare with calm defiance, who had carried her baby as if he'd been born to do it. He wasn't a man of flowery words, but what he spoke was truer than anything she'd heard in years. "I don't have much to offer," she whispered, lowering her gaze. Shame flickered in her chest. "Just myself and my son. We've lost near everything else." Ethan stepped closer, closing the space between them. He spoke gently, but with a firmness that left no room for doubt. "You've got everything worth having. A child who still calls for his mama, and the strength to fight for him even when no one else stood by you. That's more than most men I've met." Her throat tightened, tears brimming again, but these were different. born of something like hope. She hugged her baby closer, his tiny hand clinging to the collar of her dress. Ethan looked at them both, then nodded slowly, as though making peace with a decision that had been forming in him since the moment he lifted the burlap sack. "Come with me," he said at last. "My ranch has room enough, food enough, and work enough for us all. You won't want for shelter, and your boy'll grow up on good grass and clean air. You'll be safe." The words hung in the air between them. Sarah's heart thudded. A week ago, she might have scoffed at the idea of trusting another man with her life. A day ago, she might have laughed bitterly at the thought of safety. But now, with her baby's head nestled against her shoulder and the rancher's eyes steady on hers, she felt something stir inside her she hadn't felt since her husband passed, a glimpse of tomorrow. Her voice cracked. She swallowed. Trying again. "I don't even know your name." He gave a small, almost rueful smile. "Ethan McAllister." "Ethan," she repeated softly, as though testing the sound. Her baby stirred at the shift in her voice, cooing faintly. She brushed his hair back and pressed her lips to his crown. Then she looked back at Ethan, and for the first time in months, allowed herself to say the words that had long been locked in her heart. "If you'll have us, we'll come." Ethan's chest eased with a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He gave a single, firm nod. Then it settled. "You're not alone anymore." The last light of the day stretched across the corral, bathing them in gold. And in that moment, Sarah realized that what had begun as humiliation and despair had ended with something altogether different, a new bond, forged not in blood or vows, but in the quiet courage of a man who refused to turn away. Together, they stepped out of the corral, leaving behind the dust and the cruelty of Hollow Creek. Ahead lay uncertainty, but also promise a chance at safety, and perhaps even at love. The trail away from Hollow Creek was long, but for Sarah, every step taken beside Ethan felt like a widening distance from the nightmare she had endured. The dusty streets, the cruel laughter, the sight of her baby trussed up in a sack, those images lingered, yet each mile put them further behind. Her boy slept soundly in her arms, his small breaths a rhythm of peace she hadn't heard in weeks. Ethan rode beside her wagon, his tall frame steady in the saddle. He hadn't said much since they left town. That suited Sarah fine. She was not yet ready for chatter. Silence felt like balm. What mattered was that he stayed near, his presence constant as the shadow of his horse against the earth dot by the time the sun dipped low. The horizon gave way to rolling pasture. Sarah gasped softly. The land stretched wide, painted gold by evening light, dotted with grazing cattle and framed by the dark line of the distant hills. In the center stood a sturdy ranch house plain, but strong its windows glimmering with the first glow of lanterns. Ethan noticed her gaze and spoke at last. "McAllister Ranch," he said simply. "My father built it with his own hands. Been mine since he passed." Sarah swallowed, her throat thick. "It's beautiful." Ethan gave a small nod, though his eyes softened at her words. "It's quiet, but it holds." They reached the porch just as twilight fell. Ethan dismounted and offered his hand to help her down from the wagon. Sarah hesitated, unused to such courtesy, but she placed her hand in his all the same. His palm was rough, with calluses, yet gentle in its strength. For a fleeting moment, she let herself imagine what it would be like to hold such a hand not in necessity, but in trust. Inside, the house smelled of wood smoke and cedar. The hearth crackled with a fire Ethan had kindled before leaving for town. That morning, Sarah sank into a chair near the warmth, cradling her baby as if she might never let him go. Ethan set about quietly placing bread on the table, pouring water from a pitcher, moving with the unhurried rhythm of a man used to providing for himself. He set a plate before her, his tone plain but sincere. "It ain't much, but it'll fill you both." Sarah's eyes stung as she looked at the bread and stew. Days of hunger had gnawed at her and her child, but now here was a table, simple and sturdy, offering more than food, it offered dignity. She blinked back tears. "It's more than enough," her son stirred, fussing softly. She rocked him, whispering until he quieted, then brushed her lips against his forehead. The sight tugged at Ethan in a way he hadn't expected. Something about the way she held her child with fierce, unyielding love despite all she had suffered stirred the emptiness in him. For years he had told himself he didn't need family. Yet watching her, he realized what he had been missing wasn't noise or company, but this, the sight of love lived out in small, ordinary moments. After supper, Ethan stoked the fire and stood awkwardly near the doorway. "You'll have the room upstairs," he said. "Clean sheets, fresh water. You and your boy will be comfortable there." Sarah lifted her eyes to him. She wanted to thank him, but words felt too small. Gratitude alone didn't cover what he had done. He hadn't just fed her or offered a bed. He had restored something she thought lost forever, the right to be treated with care. She rose, her baby drowsing against her shoulder, and spoke softly. "You've given us more than shelter, Ethan. You've given us a chance to live again." Ethan's gaze met hers, steady and quiet. "Then that's enough for me." For a long moment, they simply looked at one another, the widow with her fragile hope, the rancher with his steadfast strength. There was no need for promises, no hurried declarations. What passed between them was deeper than words, an unspoken vow that though they had both been broken in their own ways, they would not face the road ahead alone. Sarah carried her baby up the stairs, and Ethan listened as her footsteps faded. Alone in the parlor, he let out a slow breath, staring into the fire. The house no longer felt quite so empty. The silence, once a weight, now carried a new sound hidden within it, the promise of voices, laughter, and life. And for the first time in years, Ethan McAllister smiled. Sarah would remember the cruel day Hollow Creek tried to strip her dignity, but she would also remember how a stranger's defiance turned despair into hope. And Ethan would remember how a baby's soft cry, "Mama," had awakened in him the longing he thought he had buried forever. What began as tragedy ended as the first chapter of something new, a home for the broken, built not of wood and stone alone, but of courage, love, and second chances.